Good morning. We're going to get started here in just a second with our panel discussion. It's a little bit complicated because we have two people joining virtually. They'll introduce themselves. So I can't really move this stuff. So I really apologize to Kathy and Lisa, you all sitting over here. You might want to move because I just can't move this stuff. If we want to be able to have them projected and heard. It looks like we lost Yuri. He'll be back. Our panel's going to be over here. At the end, I'll be handling questions, so I'll be asking for your jurisdiction and name, and I'll have to repeat it through here. So the panel, you all have two microphones. This one is for projecting to the audience, and then the lapel mics are so Yuri and Gerrit can hear you. And then we're recording the whole thing. Thank you, Chris. So there's a lot going on up here, but I appreciate your patience. I will say that starting now, most of the rest of our panels are available for AICP CMs. If you are AICP, you can always find them just on the APA website with the name, but I do have the numbers as well. I will be sending those out in an email to everybody who attended if that's your preferred way to find them. It's listed on, I think all of them but one are eligible for AICP credits today, and Pete, you just showed up. All right, I heard traffic was bad. Okay, all right. I'm going to turn this off for now, and then I'm going to make sure that our folks on the webinar can be heard.
Good morning, everyone. How are we going? Can folks hear and see me? Going to get any acknowledgement that I can be heard and seen? Should I just keep going?
You can be heard and seen.
Great, terrific. So thanks, everyone. It's good to see you all for this morning's plenary session entitled 30 Years of Planning in Maryland, What Have We Learned? And hopefully we've learned quite a lot. So my name is Gerrit Knapp. I am the director of the National Center for Smart Growth at the University of Maryland and a newly appointed member of the Zoning Board of Appeals for the city of Frederick, my new hometown. Hope some of you who came yesterday had a good day. We brought good weather for you. Really sorry I couldn't join you yesterday and today. Unfortunately, I tested positive for COVID on Sunday, and so I'm sparing you my germs today. And I appreciate MDP and you all, Barron's. So we have a really exciting opening session. I'm hearing some feedback. Are others hearing feedback? No? Good. I'll continue. We have highly experienced Maryland planners who reflect on the good, the bad, and the beautiful and the ugly in Maryland planning over the last 30 years. These distinguished gentlemen have planning experience in leadership positions at multiple jurisdictions in the state. And therefore, each brings a unique perspective on some of the issues that Maryland planners face, and I think will be useful and interesting for planners in the state, young and old. If you've been in Maryland a while, you've been introduced to some of the alphabet soup of planning here in Maryland, UGBs, PFAs, APFOs, TNDs, TDRs, TODs, IZs, PFAs, rural legacy, RLAs, MDP, and more. So you will hear about some of these things from these seasoned planners today, as well as their perspectives on what they think is working well and perhaps what we could make some improvements upon. So each of our speakers will get about 10 minutes to offer their thoughts. I will then ask them quickly to perhaps reflect on what some of them have said, and comments back and forth with each other, and then we'll do some Q&A and we'll wrap it up and continue with the rest of the day. So without further ado, let me introduce the first speaker. So the first speaker is Joe Rutter. Joe Rutter began his career in 1966 in Howard County. The bios, as you know, are in the program. Following that, he was the director in Howard County. He also spent time in Arundel County after retiring, pulling Tom Brady for us all. He's also spent some time in the private sector as a consultant, as an expert witness. So Joe, could you lead us off?
I'm ready. I think everybody can hear me okay. Hopefully we're not getting a lot of feedback. I'm going to start with adequate public facilities, and the way the team has been set up here, we're to take what works and what doesn't work. So if I say something works, Steve will say it doesn't, Pete will say it does, and that's kind of how we're going to bounce back and forth. Our first one is adequate public facilities ordinance, and really what they do is set a policy to implement general plan targets for growth. In order to make an adequate public facilities ordinance work, you need to start with a sound fiscal analysis that measures the cost and the benefits of new growth, and that is really set in the general plan. You have to balance the target for new residential growth with the ability to attract employment that will offset the cost of the new residential. Most residential does not fully cover its costs, primarily due to education. Having a balance of residential and jobs so employment is available to the local residents is critical. Otherwise, your road infrastructure will just collapse and you'll have more costs than benefits from the employment. You need to set a policy on the key facilities that need to be tested. Schools and roads are the typical, and some counties add public water and sewer, fire, police, and any other services. If any of these facilities are not funded to maintain the standards set in the APFO, new development can be slowed, but be aware it cannot just be stopped. There has to be a limit, and I think you probably had some discussion of that yesterday with takings cases. You need to avoid facilities that are not under county control. Howard County currently has an initiative from several citizen groups to test hospital beds. They think the hospitals are insufficient, so you should stop growth. Obviously, the county has no control over hospitals. It's regulated by the state. That would be a catastrophe. The results of the APF need to be evaluated at least annually. I know it sounds like a lot of work, but it's critical to assure that the regulations did not occur, so that there would raise a taking case, and that you're maintaining the pace of growth that you wanted to maintain in the general plan. In order to make an adequate public facilities ordinance really work, you have to achieve buy-in from the school system. Since the school system is not directly controlled by the county, and they make policy decisions on enrollment and capacities. Local government funding often includes impact fees that are considered part of an adequate public facilities plan. These fees are not there to supplant county and state funding. Most jurisdictions start with small fees for schools from new development. Howard had a reasonable cost 30 years ago of about $2 a square, less than $2 a square foot for residential, and that counted garages, unfinished basements, the whole gross area of the building. Over the years, it grew with the CPI, but today they just jumped from about $2 to over $7 a square foot, totally disregarding any fiscal analysis and the impact on affordable housing. Carroll County's a good example of commissioners recognizing impact fees, and for schools, for the past 6 years, they've set their impact fee at 0. And they openly state, the commissioners state in the public hearing, there is capacity, you need redistricting, and we're not going to pay or collect money, and that can't be matched by the state because we have capacity elsewhere. I'm going to jump to small area plans, and in this case, I'm doing the baddies. When small area planning started in the 60s and 70s, plans were developed including detailed information on specific geographic areas and to direct rezoning that would follow the general plan. These plans just looked in greater detail to inform the decision makers on needs within a specific area. These plans were prepared by consultants or in-house and included some public input to get reaction to the policies. Few had months and months, or in some cases years, of citizen committees trying to craft a plan that suited their priorities with little regard to countywide needs. Over time, the small area plan process has evolved to where citizen groups that can include both businesses and residents drive the planning on an agenda that may not be consistent with the overall county policy. The defined geographic areas for each plan may set standards in isolation from the remainder of the county or even the adjoining small area. In some cases, a separate zoning district is established with criteria that only applies in one particular area of the county. Unfortunately, what has evolved is a process where activists with the time and resources to involve themselves in the process drive their personal objectives, regardless of how those would impact the overall objectives. I liken the small area plans to me having chest pains, going to the doctor, having him tell me what needs to be done, but I say, hold on, I'm going to call my neighbors, the electrician, the plumber, the land planner, and get their opinion before I do anything. This is not to say that community input is not necessary, but recognizes that those with the time and energy can drive personal agendas. Planning commissions get education. That's why you're here. You become informed. You learn the balance. So a great forum to take input, but then the commission should make the recommendations to the elected officials, whether it's council or commissioners. Small area plans tend to set policy that is not implemented in the development zoning codes. Residents who spend a lot of time working on a small area plan find that once it's adopted, only parts of it actually get implemented. And that's very frustrating for them. They just don't understand why the zoning doesn't allow what they thought should be in the plan. Often projects are compromised and opportunities are lost while these plans are being updated. When these plans are updated every 10 years, piecemeal zoning, rezoning, regulation changes just compound and create inconsistencies because the regulations are county-wide, and what should apply in one area ends up not being appropriate for another area. The small area plans quickly enough, it's an ongoing process to try and quickly adopt. In Anne Arundel, we had 15 small area plans. And by the time you adopted the first 3, that term was over and new administrations coming in. Actually, and Steve will talk about Anne Arundel County, but my experience there is tarnished. That there were 15 small area plans. When I got there in 2003, 3 of them had been adopted, and it went over 3 different administrations before the 15 plans finally got adopted. What I also found was that the subdivision and zoning code had not been comprehensively amended in 35 years. The zoning regulations and the subdivision regulations were each over 400 pages, and no one knew what they said. We managed to, with no outside consultants, no community input, rewrote both the subdivision and the zoning code, and they were adopted in 2005. 17 years later, it's kind of messed up again. There's a lot of inconsistencies, so it's time to redo it. I'm going to give Carroll County I'm not talking about the great things, but Carroll County is a better example of small area plans. The reason for them is there's 8 incorporated towns, so each one has their own small area plan, their own zoning ordinance, and there's 2 larger targeted growth areas, Freedom and Finksburg, but they're necessary to be recognize the difference in the cities, and I think the counties with a higher growth rate would have trouble keeping up with amending the plans. So I'm going to stop.
Great, thank you. Very useful insights. Is Steve in the room? Steve has arrived. So our next speaker is Stephen Kai Zeigler. Stephen's been around for a while as well. He's worked in Maryland, in Virginia, and North Carolina. His bio, of course, also is in the program. He's currently the Planning and Zoning Officer for Anne Arundel County. Steve, can you offer some comments?
Sure. Sure. Again, Steve Zeigler, Planning and Zoning Officer for Anne Arundel County, and I have been around a long time, not as long as Joe, but a long time.
I'm the youngest of the bunch, by the way.
He is, yeah. So I'm going to touch on what we would call community planning at a regional level, and then some APF issues. And some of my comments are going to, I think, dovetail well into some of the things Joe has just said. In the sense of community planning, I started way back in the late 80s in Queen Anne's County. We got a comprehensive plan adopted in '92, and that plan was based on creating 6 community planning areas. 2 of those were oriented around the city of Centerville and Queenstown, little places, but we did basically joint community plans with those 2 municipalities. The others were unincorporated. Those plans were adopted over about a 5-year time period, and I'm proud to say that they've stayed intact. They've been updated, redone, but those community planning areas are still intact 30 years later. And it's provided the, if you want to say, the framework for how Queen Anne's County decided to grow. The vast majority of the new development was directed into those community planning areas. If you drive over the Bay Bridge and you look to your left and right, I think you would notice it looks a lot different than it did 30 years ago. Big projects like the Four Seasons, the Kay Hamdanian one, the first really large development in Queen Anne's County that ended up in the courts for about 20 years, but ultimately it's under construction now. We fast forward to Anne Arundel County, and as Joe said, the county had done a large number of small area plans, 15 or 16, I think, in the 90s. And those plans were done. They overlapped with administrations, different thoughts, different thinking processes. While they were all adopted, they essentially went on a shelf because the staff was directed then to do other things. The citizens who worked on those small area plans are pretty angry with Anne Arundel County government today, in the sense that they felt the plan that they spent 2 or 3 years working on never got implemented. And that's one of the things, the core things I want to talk about is implementation. If you're going to do a plan, a small area plan, a community plan, a general development plan, you got to implement it. And there's different ways of doing that I'll get to in just a minute, but doing a plan for the sake of doing a plan does more harm for a community and builds unmet expectations with the people who worked on it. Where we're at now in Anne Arundel County is in May of 2021, we updated a brand new GDP, General Development Plan. Great thing to happen. And we made a conscious decision after that not to go to comprehensive rezoning immediately following the GDP adoption. That's what the county had done for the most part for the last 40 to 60 years. What we decided to do was, instead of redoing the small area plans because they're so staff intensive, we didn't have the personnel, we didn't have the money, we weren't going to get consultants to redo 15 to 16 of them. There was too many for a county our size. So we kind of took the Frederick County model. When I was the planning director here, we worked on a couple, but we broke the county out into 9 regions. And we decided that we could staff creating a region, 3 region plans at a time. We're currently about halfway through the first 3 region plans, and we will start the next 3 before we finish with the first 3. And the key thing here is that we're going to do comprehensive rezoning with each one of those region plans instead of at the next GDP. The idea is we will create 9 region plans, go through 9 versions of comprehensive rezoning by region, which allows the stakeholder advisory committee members to really push hard on the elected officials not to do the things they usually do, which is to upzone everywhere they can find a way to do it. After that, we will create implementation advisory groups for each one of those regions to hold our feet to the fire. We just stood up our GDP implementation advisory group last Saturday. And the whole idea of these implementation advisory groups, while we have a stakeholder group to create a plan, the implementation advisory group is to force us to implement it. So that's kind of what we're doing from a community planning standpoint in Anne Arundel. I think I want to shift here and talk a little bit about APF, and in particular school APF. almost every jurisdiction now in Maryland has a version of an adequate public facilities ordinance. Joe told you, explained to you what the purpose of that was. One of the problems with school APF throughout the state, but in particular in Arundel, is that we have a system that is shutting down residential development in a half to 2/3 of the county every year because we're over capacity. I chair a group in the county that's been underway for 2 years now, and it's the Public School APFO Work Group, and it's oriented around what we're going to do with APFO, the standards that relate to residential developments for schools. Data collection, and I'm going to just throw a question out to y'all. Everyone knows that new residential development causes school overcrowding, right? Yes, I mean, that's what most people think. And there is evidence all over the state, all over the country that that's a lot of silliness. Anne Arundel County issues about 2,000 new building permits a year. We have existing home sales not related to those new residential building permits. That is about 13,000. An existing home sale produces the same number of public school students as a new building permit does, but no one realizes that. And Joe explained the Howard County effort by their elected officials, frustration with the Board of Education for not redistricting. We've gone back in time 20 years. We are averaging 12,500 vacant seats a year. A year. That's not 1 year. That's not 2. Every year, that's what we are averaging. This school work group, the intent here is to radically overhaul school APF. If we don't overhaul that and fix our school APF problems, there's no way any of us can realistically think about providing affordable housing in our communities. It just isn't going to happen. So that's my thoughts on those two subjects. I think it's time to pass it over to the youngest one of us.
Hey, Uri, I might go off a little script now. I had to listen to Joe and Steve. So I'm going to talk, I think, similar to what these guys have said. Well, first of all, I'm Pete Gutwald. I'm actually the Director of Permits, Approvals, and Inspections for Baltimore County, but I spent a year and a half prior to that as being the Director of Planning for Baltimore County. Prior to that, I was in the city of Annapolis, and then Harford County for the longest time. I just was thinking, Gerrit, did you want to say something, buddy? I'm sorry, you didn't get a chance to introduce me. I'm going off script, buddy. Stick with me. You're on mute now. Is he done, Joe? All right, I'm going to go on. I think. Thanks. I forgot that I spent 24 years in Harford County. That's crazy, right? But anyways, I got the side. Anyways, I think what you're hearing from all of us is that at a high level, your general development plan, your comprehensive plan, your master plan, jurisdictions tend to do very well with that. They set out a pattern of where they want to grow and how they want to grow. There's very specific geographic areas that they have identified of what they want to do, what the intensity of growth will be happening in the county. But for the next 10, 20, whatever years, we've done a great job of identifying and tying that into our master water and sewer plans, which is required by the state, right? To say whether you've provided the infrastructure and all that good stuff and the community facilities and things like that. Baltimore County has an urban rural designation development line, and then what's called the URDL. We talked about the alphabet soup. And then Harford County has a development envelope. It's a very geographic defined area of where we want to grow. And in the most part, you're sitting there talking about this is the intensities, this is where we want the growth to occur, and this is where we want to preserve land, right? We want to do agricultural preservation, we want to do land preservation in the other parts of the county. But we have this very geographic area. What I think every one of us is telling us is what happens is along the line when we set out these plans, we start talking about very specific policies and strategies and recommendations, and then the implementation and follow through in some of these rules and regulations that Joe and Steve have talked about, we don't do a very good job of following up with that. And I'm going to go a little off script here because there's a lot of talk about small area plans. So Baltimore County had 90 plus small area plans, community plans, whatever you want to call, didn't cover the whole county. You know, he kind of missed the whole north end of the county. He just talked about the specific geographic areas along the Beltway for the most part. Harford County had a whopping 2 community plans that they had done. And the city of Annapolis had what they called sector plans, and they had gone through and it basically covered the whole city, but some of these things dated back to 1992, right? And I'm sitting in front of a planning commission or a board of appeals, and they're arguing the 1992 sector area plan, yet we had done 2 or 3 other master plans in the county. So like in Harford County, I attempted to take the community plans and roll them into the master plan and say, instead of trying to divvy up the county and do these very specific plans for each and every one of these areas, let's bring these things and bring it and roll it into the master plan. I attempted to do that in the city of Annapolis. I don't know where it went. I left. I went to Baltimore County for that because in the city of Annapolis, there were so many of these different sector plans that people kept talking about. But which one was more applicable? We had, if you're familiar with the city of Annapolis, you have, Ward 1, right? We had the Ward 1 plan, but then they had the city dock master plan. Okay, which one took precedent? They're both existing, sitting out there. But we have a terrible time of saying, how does this roll into small area plans? Back to my goodies. So we do a great job of designating these specific areas for growth and trying to manage how we're going to grow and where we're going to grow. We also do a great job of identifying those areas and supplementing these areas where we're looking for commercial revitalization, or we're looking for redevelopment and revitalization areas. Baltimore County has about 18 of these areas where they've implemented programs where they provide business tax credits, business improvement loans, things like that, to make sure that these things have incentives for people to reinvest in their older and existing neighborhoods, as did City of Annapolis. Harford County attempted to do a Route 40 revitalization area. That's the oldest and existing area communities up along there. City of Aberdeen and Havre de Grace are part and parcel to all that, trying to parlay and create more reinvestment and redevelopment in those areas. So I'll go into my baddies. As I said, some of these, the implementation piece of, putting these general development plans, comprehensive plans, whatever you want to call them, into action. We have these very specifics. Steve and Joe talked about APFL. I'll just bounce off of Steve's idea. Talking about, we think all residential growth is associated with overcapacity in schools. I can tell you that's not true for Baltimore County. It wasn't true for the city of Annapolis. And the issue with those of you who are in municipalities, you're part of a county. You don't have control over the board. None of us, have the control over the Board of Education. But the city of Annapolis was contingent upon what the Anne Arundel County was going to do in terms of their APFO, right? So we're sort of subservient to the county itself, trying to say, okay, what are you guys doing for school planning over here? Well, we're the city, but these schools are in our city. I'll give you an example. Tyler Heights Elementary School and Germantown Elementary School were reaching 120% of their capacities. And I did the analysis in the city of Annapolis. We had 4 building permits over 5 years. 4 new building permits over 5 years, yet these schools were well over capacity. It wasn't related to new growth at all. It was just the existing community and population turning over to the existing and older neighborhoods. But one of the other things I'll talk about that I think we don't do very well, we have good intentions. Everybody has great intentions on trying to balance the housing needs of each one of their jurisdictions. And we try to do that through you give it different names: affordable housing, workforce housing. We're trying to provide the ability for our workforce to be able to live and work in the existing homes, communities. So, there's a number of, jurisdictions do different types of programs, and I think Howard County probably has one of the better ones. I'll give them credit to that. But, for instance, like City of Annapolis had a moderately priced dwelling unit program. That was the idea of providing, because it's very expensive to live in the city of Annapolis, but we have demands and services and people to work those service jobs, right? Not just your police force and your teachers. It's also those individuals that are working those service industries that, don't get paid a whole lot of money, but they have to travel, 45 minutes to get to the city dock, if you will, and then pay for parking, right? So the idea was for that. Well, it's a great idea. It was required with every development. You had to provide, based on the percentage of the number of units that you were going to build, you had to provide a number of dwelling units. But the problem is there was a big old out, right? called fee in lieu. Let me write a check for you, and I don't have to provide that housing, that unit for that development. I believe since then they have changed that, because I was pushing that when I was down there, so say get rid of the fee in lieu. They have to provide the units, and they have to provide a unit that's equivalent to the market rate homes that they're providing, because they weren't doing that. And it was a subservient, it was a subordinate, whatever you would call a unit compared to what else the rest of the development was providing in that area. So we were modifying some of that, recognizing some of the flaws with that. Harford County have provided just an incentive. They gave you a density bonus. As did the city of Annapolis, they gave you what they call tolerances, which allowed you to achieve your densities. The funny thing is that the permitted zoning, you couldn't achieve the permitted zoning with all the other rules and regulations, environmental, public works, you name it, whatever it is. They couldn't even achieve the densities that were permitted by right, much less get the density that they wanted in order for us to provide housing bonuses. So those are some of the examples of what I say, I think we're all saying is that we have the plan set out. It's just the implementation of putting it behind it and following through with some of these rules and regulations that achieve the goal that you have identified in your master planning, in your comprehensive plan, or even in your small area plans, that I think are some of the issues that we don't follow through with. How am I doing on time, Ernie or Gerrit? Right about there? Well, I was just going to say one last thing, because how many people are on planning commissions or boards in the room? Every year, you do what? The capital improvement program, right? Everybody reviews it. You ever wonder why the planning commission and board is responsible for reviewing that document? It's because it's supposed to be a plan. It's supposed to be a 6-year plan. But most jurisdictions focus on the given year. And it turns into a budgeting document instead of a planning document. But in almost every jurisdiction I've worked for, including Baltimore County, as large as it is, the planning board is responsible for reviewing the capital improvement program. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Pete. Are you done?
Yep.
Great.
Yep, I'm done.
Well done. Thanks so much. Last and certainly least, I want to introduce my good friend and my former colleague, Avin. Uri has spent time planning in Howard County and in Baltimore County. He is in the private sector for many years, and I had the very good fortune of working with Uri for over a decade at the National Center for Smart Growth. I want to give Uri credit for organizing this panel as well. So take it away, Uri.
Thanks, Gerrit. So I'm going to talk about 2 programs and tools. One's a goodie, and I'm going to talk about a good way of doing APFOs as an example. And then my baddie is going to be talking about urban growth boundaries as applied in Maryland, particularly central Maryland. So let me start off with the APFO good example. You've heard from several people about the challenges in fine-tuning an APFO so it actually paces growth with infrastructure. That's a very difficult thing to do, and I don't think anyone in Maryland has done it right. There's less and less money to build schools and build roads at both the state and local levels. So the net effect of APFOs has been to slow growth or to stop growth. Joe mentioned you can't stop growth, but Montgomery County over the decades has had moratoria for 12 years or more over many parts of the county and has sustained taking challenges at the courts and maintained their moratoria. So the net effect has been to stop or slow growth of APFOs. They were developed in the period of rapid growth of the state, but now we've slowed as a state significantly. For example, the Baltimore region in the year 2000, the whole Baltimore region approved about 12,000 new permits. In the year 2020, approved about 8,000 new permits. So in a world where growth has slowed significantly, it's a reasonable question to ask, what's the point of an APFO, which depends on staging new growth with facilities. If there's not much new growth, it doesn't make any sense. And Steve gave you the example of Arundel County, where there's this dislocation between schools and districts and vacancies, but also the fact that real school growth is coming from turnover of existing residents, not from new growth. And the example I want to focus on is Montgomery County. If you're looking for a model, an analysis and planning tool, look at their what's become their annual growth policy equivalent subdivision staging growth between 2018 and 2020. They began with a strict APFO for roads and schools in 1973. By the year 2015, it was causing moratoria, losing revenue, slowing growth, stopping job growth pace, and they massively overhauled it and have now a completely new approach. They found that about 77% of school enrollment was due to housing turnover, not new development. And I think Anne Arundel County has found a similar piece of information. So with 3/4 of growth coming from housing turnover, Anne Arundel County decided to completely redo their old APFO. They stopped their moratorium. They did a huge amount of careful analysis looking at different areas and the impacts they had on school based on age, kind of housing, and tuned their new growth management system in a very specific way to each area or sub area based on its impacts. They now apply a form of APFO for developers in infill areas and new growth areas, but much of their growth management is applied to turnover and applies to a recordation tax increase. So when a house is sold, the actual revenue and control is at the time of sale through recordation tax. They calculate that had they had this in place in 2019, they would have yielded $20 million more in revenues for construction than otherwise. So again, I'd really suggest you look at their piece of work. It's an excellent example for mature counties in central Maryland that have little or limited growth. Let me frame the housing affordability issue that Pete raised and others talked about, and the APFO issue in a bigger context. And that is that of the reality of most of Maryland's central counties having urban growth boundaries that were established in the 70s, 80s, and 90s and have not moved since. So the fundamental cause of our housing affordability crisis is the limited supply of land that we have in central Maryland. I did an analysis in 4 years ago, and the average number of years left for new growth in central Maryland, excluding the city of Baltimore, was on the order of 18 years, a low of about 8 years of growth, greenfields growth, new development growth, a low of about 8 years in Howard County and Anne Arundel County, and a high of about 27 years or 30 years in Prince George's County. So we have a fundamental problem because our urban growth boundaries, which we established in stone 20, 30, 40 years ago, have not moved the way they've been applied in Maryland. Not all states have applied them that way. Portland, which is Gerrit's early stomping ground, Portland put in place a requirement that they be elastic and that they grow and that they expand over time. Maryland's never done that. So in a basic way, the question, particularly for those of you who are in jurisdictions that are growing and not in central Maryland, the central question is, should you do an urban growth boundary? And if so, how should you do it? Let me give 3 recommendations. If you're going to establish one, you want to establish a fairly loose boundary. Traditionally, 20, 25 years growth was assumed in comprehensive plans. We have found that that is now built out for the most part. So I would recommend that if you're going to do it, think 50 years of growth, and within that envelope, phase your growth explicitly. So in your plan, it's clear which tier of growth occurs when, at what point, or under what conditions, and connect your sewer and water expansion plan to that expansion program. What that means is that you have to downzone and have low density in your first expansion areas and your second, so that it doesn't get preempted by low density rural development, which will then oppose any expansion of the growth boundary. This is hard to achieve, but it's probably the best way to go. And you'd have to obviously require regular updates of urban growth boundary. There's a role the state can play here to make it easier. The state adopted priority funding areas in 1997 and onwards, which helped lock in place urban growth boundaries. If the state could make those more elastic, and if the state could make their septic tiers, which prevent rural growth, more elastic, so that they could also be potentially rolled back to allow for more supply of suburban and urban land, those would be critical steps in making housing more affordable in Maryland. Any number of MPDU, moderately priced dwelling unit programs that Pete described will not solve the problem. Montgomery County's famous program has not really solved the problem. Research suggests that what happens is when you have to put 12% aside or 15 for affordable units, the rest of the units simply go up in price. It's not a net win-win, it's a net lose-lose. So that would be my primary recommendation, stepping back and looking at Maryland's experience over 40 years. That's it for me.
Great, thank you very much. Provocative as usual. So what I'd like to do now is give the panel a chance to reflect on what some of their colleagues have said. And let me try and frame the question this way. So as many of you mentioned, housing affordability is clearly one of the most pressing challenges for the state in the future. Recent research we did at the Smart Growth Center demonstrated that there was a significant shortage of affordable housing now and as well as into the future. And affordable housing and social equity, clearly is on the forefront of planning challenges. So Uri has just posed that our growth boundaries or our PFAs are a major contributing cause of the housing inaffordability. So in the order that you spoke, Joe, Steve, and Pete, I'd welcome you to reflect on what Uri has said, and if you have other strategies that you think would be most effective for addressing the housing affordability and social equity problems, please offer them to us. So Joe, can you get us started?
Yes. I'm the grumpy old man, so I get to take the opposite of whatever these other
We're all
rest of
grumpy
them.
old men, so.
It may be appropriate in some jurisdictions to revisit priority funding area, growth boundaries, and so forth. Using Howard County as one example, and Arundel County is also a great example. There are, Columbia's 60-some years old. It has housing that was built, townhouses and small, even single-family houses. Townhouses were in the $15,000 to $20,000 a unit range. Not a lot has happened to those. They're concentrated, the utilities are there, the facilities are there. Redevelopment of those areas is what needs to be encouraged, not going back out into the rural area where, in Howard County's example, what his concern was is the boundary along the border is so fixed that it's a pipe dream to think that you're going to go out there and have any major expansions of those areas. What Pete touched on, the moderately priced dwelling units and requiring everyone to do them. In Howard County, single-family new housing projects in the rural area, they start around 900,000, go to $1.3 million. On the little quarter-acre lots, we have some of them that are approaching $1 million. Some of them are as low as $600,000-$700,000. I can give you a house, no charge, if you are making 80% of the median. You can't pay the taxes. You can't pay for the, you're going to have the 1982 Toyotas sitting in the yard next to all the Range Rovers and the Mercedes. So sorry, folks, it just doesn't work. But Howard County Housing Commission is very proactive in setting the fees and using those fees for projects that they can either subsidize or construct on their own that provide affordable housing, not concentrated in one building that's 100% MIHUs, but working with the developer where you can take 20% of each building and accomplish it that way. So my experience in Howard County is they actually encourage you to pay the fee in lieu rather than try and put 10 MIHUs in a 100-unit project with $800,000 houses. That it just doesn't work. The final comment is about school capacity. And both Steve and Pete talked about how much is from new growth and how much is from resale of existing housing. I think the other thing to keep in mind, and you see this as Planning Commission as you go through capital budgets and so forth, it is, go back to when Howard County 30 years ago, we're doing 30 years of planning, kindergarten was, I'll just take elementary schools, kindergarten was voluntary half-day programs. Kindergarten then went to full-day programs. Now there's pre-K. Now there's going to be mandatory pre-K. Each one of those, and when you went from half-day kindergarten to full-day kindergarten, you doubled the number of classrooms necessary. So you have the capacity in that elementary school to take that 1/6 of the total grades that you have. One of the games that, I shouldn't say games, one of the approaches that the school system uses when they measure capacity, 800 square feet equals a classroom. If it's less than 800 square feet, it gets 0 capacity assigned to it. I have an ESOL, English for Speakers of Other Language program. And I also have, which I'm a tremendous advocate of, inclusion, where when children have disabilities, you do everything you can to have them in the least restrictive environment. But that may mean putting 10 kids, because that's all you have in that school, into a room. Well, if I cut the room in half and I put 10 in one side of the room and 10 in the other side of the room, when we're measuring capacity and you hear about the overcrowding, that room counts as 0 capacity because it's not 800 square feet. There's, other than Howard County in the early 90s started building middle school gyms and middle school cafeterias with the understanding that they would use relocatables to help assist, but not have lunch program in an elementary school that starts at 9 o'clock in the morning and ends at 3. You just can't get them through the elementary school cafeteria in time. They're all legitimate concerns, but there's legitimate solutions to them. And I think that, I'll stop. You're one.
All righty. Thank you, Joe. And yeah, we can go on and on about this. I mean, when you do this kind of work as long as we have, we've tried all kinds of amazing, innovative, out-of-the-box ways of addressing our issues. And because we've been here a long time, we see over time the impacts. And I'll touch on a couple things. And there's a lot that Joe said I absolutely agree with. On PFAs, are they good things or bad things? Well, where did the whole PFA legislation come from? It came from the state, because the state was looking at the counties and saying, look, you folks, you're building a high school 20 miles away from a municipality, not on public sewer and water, and now you want to run sewer and water lines to that school. And over time, what does occur is that you start upzoning the land along that transmission line. And so you end up inadvertently creating new growth areas longitudinal-wise that you never planned for. And the state got frustrated with local governments, and they said, you're going to have to combine this. It's always awkward to deal with. We hated preparing those maps. We hate when we have to change a PFA boundary because it's just a lot of bureaucratic nonsense. But I think there was a point, and what it did was it forced the counties to better plan for where the real growth would occur and not just build out when they built water and sewer lines to those schools or whatever they were building at the time. For MPDUs, I too have not seen it successfully implemented anywhere. Anne Arundel County has had, I think, over the last 20 years, 3 different work groups that they get together, they appoint people, they're all well-meaning, and they work hard on producing something that might be legislatively adopted, and it doesn't happen. We had one in my first 2 years in Anne Arundel County. Tremendous level of effort to try and figure out a way to do it in our county, and it just slowly petered out. Talking about anything that is workforce or affordable type housing in Anne Arundel, I think the biggest issue, I talked about this in my comments, is the school APF component. We're having some...
It's really fine. Go ahead. That's my...
So it's the school APF issue that's the primary driver, and it is affecting every jurisdiction in Maryland. Everybody knows it. There's, all of the forecasters are estimating that we're going to need to absorb a lot more housing than anyone is accommodating today. And the single biggest reason is because we're not letting it happen, because we have legislation that doesn't allow it to happen. And it's silly, and that's got to change. Hopefully, we're preparing legislation now this fall, assuming we have a second term. In the second term, that will probably come forward and radically overhaul what Anne Arundel County has historically done. But it's going to take 7 votes. I would also say on affordable housing, workforce housing, we have an issue in Anne Arundel in that, aside from the school capacity issue, which affects where development can go, the properties, we don't have enough land properly zoned to accommodate the level of affordable workforce housing we think we want. So that what that does is it forces the folks who might build that type of product to go look at what I call distressed properties that are too small, irregularly shaped, have all kinds of environmental features on them. And in Anne Arundel, we have this unique thing, Joe and I both love it and hate it, is called modifications. That is unique in Maryland in the sense that whoever's the OPZ officer can grant essentially variances to anything. And I mean, in anywhere else in your jurisdictions, you would have to go to a Board of Appeals or a hearing examiner. When Joe and I sit in these jobs, it's us who makes those decisions, and there's strong criteria what you have to fill out. But we're getting the projects that are coming in for affordable housing. They need a mod to disturb non-tidal wetlands, non-tidal wetland buffers. They can't meet forest conservation regs. They can't or won't meet their recreation space needs. They can't meet their setbacks. They can't meet any of the code requirements. So you get a list of 15 modifications, and you're realizing when you're looking at this affordable housing project that it's not really cool anymore. It's a project. The type of things that were built in the 40s and 50s and 60s that, as a good community planner, we wouldn't want to do. So then we deny the mods, okay, which makes the person who wants to do affordable housing angry with the county because the county says they want affordable housing and we're doing all these things that prohibit it. It's not designed to prohibit it. These properties shouldn't, they were passed over by other developers because of all the problems with the projects. So now that leaves it, it's the scraps that are left. So that's been an issue. The other one is most of them say they need relief from development review fees, from water and sewer fees, from impact fees. So remember, when you grant relief to a developer for any reason on those type of things, the county as a whole absorbs those costs, which there's a fairness issue with that. So that's something that comes into mind. I'm going to say for us, one of the key things, coming back to school capacity, is that we hate redistricting. Historically, Anne Arundel hated it, and they had an appointed Board of Ed. Now we have an elected Board of Ed. And there hasn't been a single redistricting, to my knowledge, that has occurred in the last three years. I mean, tiny little things. So remember, when you're on a board or a commission or you're an elected official, the hardest job is making those difficult decisions. I think the hardest job in government of anything that we do is redistricting, if you've ever been through it. It is an awful, awful undertaking, and because you're getting upfront and personal with people and their families and where their kids go to school. So one thing that I was very happy to hear, if you recall, I said we stood up our GDP implementation advisory group, and one of the members of that group is the president of the Board of Education. And some of the things I'm saying today, she said last Saturday. So I'm sensing that between what our work group is doing and this newfound love fest between the county and at least the president of the Board of Ed, we're probably the best position we've ever been to take some very, very difficult steps to address some of these issues we're talking about. Peter?
Okay. Can you tell Uri's worked for the private sector for as long as he has after leaving the public sector? No, I'm just kidding, because he's about the only one who probably thinks that we need to expand our areas. And in Harford County and in Baltimore County, that was the same arguments from the development community, the property owners, is that we need, in order to provide additional housing and growth needs and affordable housing, we need to expand our designated growth areas in order to achieve that. And I'm going to have to agree with Joe in which there are other opportunities and ways to do that through the redevelopment, revitalization programs. And like in Baltimore County, we're looking at incentivizing some of the older Essex, Dundalk communities, Woodlawn communities, where there are the blighted homes and communities where we're trying to incentivize how somebody can go in and redevelop these areas, and at the same time we're gonna provide additional dollars, county dollars, federal dollars to provide for affordable housing. If you don't know, Baltimore County was under a voluntary compliance agreement because they weren't providing the affordable housing opportunities in the county. And when you talk about 80%, Baltimore County is under a requirement under the federal government, HUD, to provide homes for 60% and 30% of the AMI, average median income. So that's even more difficult. So there has to be, government money and assistance, subsidies, as well as tax credits and all the other stuff to make these things kind of happen and work. But there are other rules and regulations that you guys sit on boards and commissions that have the opportunities and can be the mouth for implementing these kinds of things. Part of this is accessory dwelling units. That's a huge effort that's going on nationwide. Part of it is looking at the types of zoning and restricting the types of zoning that can go in any given jurisdiction, so you provide the opportunity for those affordable types of units. The last thing that I'll mention about affordable housing is that in the city of Annapolis, one of the things I talk about is the fee in lieu and the weakness in the fee in lieu, because you have to pay attention to what you're actually going to calculate as that fee in lieu, and how do you calculate that? In Annapolis, it was the construction cost. So I'll give an example of what Joe was saying. City of Annapolis, we had a development community. They had to provide one dwelling unit. That's all they had to provide, and they didn't want to do that. So they said, well, we'll pay the fee in lieu. I got $89,000 for this unit in Eastport, if you're familiar with the city of Annapolis. Each one of those units, the units in that development, the cheapest one was $1.2 million. So we got $89,000 for a fee in lieu for something they were $1 million plus in each and every one of the units. I think I'm going to stick to that. We could talk to APFO to the end of the earth. Its weaknesses and positives. I'll just mention, if you saw me pat Joe on the back, he was in Howard County. I was in Harford County when they were doing the PFAs, and Joe and I were going head to head with the Secretary of Maryland Department of Planning, arguing with him about what he's trying to do and what he's not trying to do. So that's just a side joke to tell you that, you know, I think the counties, jurisdictions do a good job of trying to manage the growth, but I agree with Steve. The state was looking at it statewide and trying to develop a program where they were going to prioritize what? Their capital improvement programs, their money, where they were going to direct their funds to if you were going to play along with the rules. So that was sort of the game plan of that. And APFO plays a part of that. And I'll just mention one other thing about APFOs with like the city of Annapolis and many of you, I see some familiar faces from municipalities. When you're dealing with the county, the school district boundaries don't follow, just stay within the city, right? They go into the county. And the county could have one standard and the city would have another standard. And who rules? Well, I mean, who gets the short end of the stick on that, right? So those are some of the issues you grapple with when you have, you know, interjurisdictional issues with the ability to manage your development, your growth, and your taxes, basically. So I'll end with that.
Thanks, Pete. So let me give our provocateur an opportunity to take some of the arrows out of his back. So, Gerrit.
Thanks, Gerrit. So, by the way, my consultancy has been for the public sector. Just to respond to Pete's comment, I've really worked very little for the private sector, and my experience and perspective on urban growth boundaries is based not only on my Maryland experience, but on working as a consultant for jurisdictions in 26 states around the country for a long time. Let me be clear, I'm not so naive as to imagine that Howard County or Montgomery County or Baltimore County politically will be able to move their urban growth boundaries. Clearly, that's a political suicide mission. However, there are second and third tier counties further out, Cecil County, Washington County, Culver County, that may be considering how to think about growth management. And it's in those contexts that you want to be very careful about how you apply an urban growth boundary. I do believe that there may be some wiggle room, even in Harford County and maybe even in Arundel County, along some edges of the current boundary for services. And those are worth exploring. And the point I was making was that the state can facilitate that expansion by relaxing its PFA and septic bill standards. I would say that I don't believe, and I hear Joe and I hear Pete talk about redevelopment. I don't believe that outside of a few counties where there's a strong market and it's profitable for developers to redevelop, I don't believe that that will ever create enough housing to meet the need in Maryland. It'll help some. MPDUs in Montgomery County over what, a 30, 40-year period have maybe generated 20,000 units if we're lucky. That's nothing compared to the need. So yeah, revitalization is worthwhile, but it has to be seen in parallel with other more dramatic and strong sources of supply. They aren't mutually exclusive. And Montgomery County and Howard County, sure, it'll pay developers to do teardowns and rebuild and raise prices, squeezing out the middle income workers in these revitalized neighborhoods like Kensington in Montgomery County. And the MPDU approach won't ever provide enough units to deal with workforce housing. So I'm not saying that moving UGBs is easy, but given the alternatives, it's one that has to be explored.
Great, thank you, Gerrit. Very interesting comments. Want to give the audience a chance to participate and ask some questions. So Joe, if you wouldn't mind facilitating the Q&A, but I'd like the prerogative of asking the last question. It's 25, sorry, 10:55. So Joe, can you handle it from here?
Sorry, Gerrit, what was the last question you wanted me to ask?
I'd like to ask the last question, but if you could facilitate some Q&A.
Oh, I see.
Okay. So yeah, we'll take questions from the audience. I'm just to make that because the panelists that are here virtually are not going to be able to hear you. So I need you to say your name, your jurisdiction, then your question, and then I'll have to repeat it to them. So it might sound repetitive, but that's the only way we're going to hear. Yes, first question.
So I'm Barbara and others. The county council passed the legislation to basically stop growth in Howard County all over this school issue. So I'm not, I think my question is more like, how does a planning staff actually educate elected officials so they learn all these great things that some of the things that you talked today about the existing home sales, I've never heard that. And I would fairly say the county council there doesn't understand that. So how do you deal with that?
Okay, all right, let me try to
Okay.
reword. No, I'll do my best. So that was Barbara Nicholas, Planning Commission Chair for Frederick City. Addressed everybody last night. Thank you for your address last night. And the question goes back to Howard County Council basically suspending development because of school concerns. And so the question now for the panel is how can staff educate the elected officials that is not the proper approach, that, how can they educate on the things that you've learned over the years effectively, I guess communicate to the elected officials to get them to concur, agree. Is that correct?
Yes, actually, that's exactly.
It's a great question, and I'll continue to be candid.
Good luck with that.
Yeah, right. The issue is in Howard, which is not unique. Elected officials are being successful in getting elected with a no-growth platform, and there's going to come a point where, and this is not the first time in Howard. The same thing happened in the 80s, and county executive didn't get reelected, new person came in. At the time, the person who came was a former deputy superintendent of schools. One of the council person was the chief financial officer for the school system. So when we were initially going through adequate public facilities, nobody was going to pull the wool over the administration's eyes. Howard, in a couple of weeks, has an opportunity to have 3 strong, absolute, no growth, anti-development, anti-business council people, which is the majority. 5-member council. It's won the rural district, whether the incumbent Republican wins or the Democrat that's running against him is openly hostile. And right now, it's always 3-2, one way or the other, one votes. But the 2 anti-growth, we're talking about redevelopment in Columbia, participated in, Kimco owns the village centers. There was a successful redevelopment of the Wild Lake Village Center, the oldest one in the county. There was an attempt to redevelop the Hickory Ridge Village Center, and the council person heard her constituents, and it was denied. That same developer is not going to go and spend the money and the time to go to the next one that needs to be redeveloped. The county intervened 3 years ago with a new administration in redevelopment of the Long Reach Village Center. County bought it, and it sits there vacant. County also bought 14 buildings in Ellicott City because of the flooding that they were going to redevelop or tear down or do something with, and they sit there boarded up. Howard is in a very difficult time, but there's positives. You're in Frederick. Frederick is probably the most successful large city in the state of Maryland. Not probably, is, in my opinion, the most successful large city in the county, better than Rockville or some of the ones in Prince George's or obviously Baltimore City. But the urban growth boundary, Frederick will annex another area and keep control. Carroll County is the same way. The urban growth boundary, the city is exempt. It's automatically Tier 1 because it's an incorporated city. Westminster annexes on a very regular basis, but it's done in a plan-controlled way, and they control the utilities. And it becomes a partnership between the county and its planning commission and its county commissioners and the city council, aldermen, and mayor or town manager. They all work together with it. So there are ways to expand those planned service areas. One of the things you're going to hear this afternoon, just popping off my rant on Howard County politics, but it's scary. It's scary. I grew up in Howard County. I moved to Carroll County for 20 years and raised my family there. Came back to Howard County when I became Urie's deputy, and they wanted me to move back to Howard County, which was fine, and I'm still there. One of the things you're going to hear this afternoon about climate change, for those of you that picked that session, and they're worried about the infiltration of salt water and water infiltration and how it's impacting septic systems and so forth. Look at your new development codes that so many of you are on planning commissions. Look at your new development codes. I'm all in favor of infiltration for stormwater management. But when you look at how it's implemented in the rural areas, a lot of times your septic system is sitting not far from that infiltration system. Well, duh, why would you do something like that? You want to, when these projects were built, the idea was to get the stormwater into a retention facility and then slowly released. I agree in urban areas it may be great to try and get more infiltration, but in the rural areas, balance that with what you're doing to your septic systems if you start doing infiltration right next to them. Joe?
Yeah, I'd also like to. Oh, no,
Nobody could.
I'm just going to add 2 cents to that, to your question would be, because, and I'm going to partner with Steve, because Steve was the director in Harford County when I was still working as a peon down there in Harford County. But anyways, one of the things that we did was provide a lot of data. We gave the council and the public the information so they could assess what the problem is. And one of the things when Steve was in Harford County and we were working through impact fees, there's this great correlation between your impact fees, school construction, and growth, right? That has to happen in order for you to receive that money to provide the capital, what I'm going to go back to, the capital improvement program, so in order you to build the schools to solve some of the problems. So now, that's all.
And I'll be quick. I'm going to tell a little story about Pete. When I first got to Harford County in 2003, first time I met him. Oh, is this better? Sorry. So when I first got to Harford County in 2003, and Pete was like the chief of community planning, I think, or something. And so first thing he says to me is he's holding up this big document. What is a CIP? And I looked at him and I'm like, well, it's a plan. And he threw it up in the air and he says, thank God somebody knows what a CIP is. Do you remember that? So, but I wanted to touch on your question from the Anne Arundel County thing. Very different than Howard County, as near as I can tell. And since I've lived in Anne Arundel since '98, so we don't elect council members who are anti-growth. If there's 7 of them, and if I can't think of one who's really anti-growth over the last 20 years, because they're elected through contributions that almost always come from a property owner or a developer, which is common in most places, but it's how it works in Anne Arundel. And so they're not doing anything that would slow or stall or stop development. In fact, Anne Arundel County Council amends the county code on land use legislation 30 to 40 times a year. So imagine how active your councils or commissions are. And when Joe said, we last overhauled the code in 2005 and it's time now, it is because we, both the administration and the council, have just killed that code with, death by 1,000 cuts. almost all of that legislation is designed to help a constituent. And I mean to changing zoning, a lot of zoning, I'm going to say a lot of text amendments that look suspiciously like spot zoning. Not that that would happen, but they...
Just because they mentioned the green mailbox, that
Yeah.
doesn't mean anything.
So it's different. I mean, I joke that every jurisdiction I've worked in, and it's a lot, between the three of us, we've worked in 2/3 of Maryland. Every jurisdiction has its own pathology. I joke that Anne Arundel has all of the pathologies. So they're different. I mean, Howard took a stance. They wanted to be something different than they had been for years and years, and Anne Arundel is rocking and rolling towards the future the way it always has. So just a different perspective for different places.
Any other questions? Yes, in the back.
Gerrit, do you want to respond to this?
Just briefly, let me respond directly to the question about educating. The state of Maryland and Howard County, particularly Howard County, have developed a very good curriculum for citizen leaders, planners, people who are interested, to teach them the basics about planning and zoning and so forth. So at a very basic level, I would look at the award-winning Howard County curriculum. Baltimore County is developing that idea right now as well. So it's not necessarily an direct answer to the question about education, but it sets a baseline, and you shouldn't ignore that option. So just to pick up on Steve's point about Anne Arundel counties not electing anti-growth council people, I think there's an inevitable evolution. As places, counties mature from fast growing to slow growing to built out and redeveloping, there's an inevitable evolution towards no growth or slow growth. Developers have less power electorally, and existing homeowners have much more power. And I've seen that trajectory in Howard County over 30 years, and it's true nationally. So that I don't think one can rely on electing no growthers. As you mature and build out in Anne Arundel County, which you have been doing rapidly for the last decade and will for the next decade, beyond that, the environment will change. And you should assume that you will have no growthers running the show. And therefore, you'll be working with incentives and other kinds of tools to create desirable growth areas and growth management regimes.
Are there other questions in the room?
Panelists, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. My name is Daniel Cross, and I'm here this morning wearing my necktie that has a black sheep intermingled with white sheep. And that is because I am a developer. I am not a planner. I am a consumer of your services, or the guy that cuts the checks to the politicians. I rise this morning to remind all of us in our industry that in the end, the public gets a vote. I've listened with interest to this discussion because I'm trying to create affordable housing. I earn my livelihood by creating places for people to live, play, and work. And yet, Jill Baker from Washington County's known me, and I've been trying one in Smithsburg in Washington County for 18 years, and we're finally getting to approval. Kelly Duty is here from Thurmont. I spent the last 4 years working with her on a project, and we're going to petition for referendum because the citizens object to a plan that's been in both the Frederick County and the town of Thurmont plan for 13 years. So my question to the panelists is, what do we do to better educate a citizenry that for most parts doesn't care about the zoning of the neighborhoods around them, so that they have a sense of what change is coming? We've heard the suggestion that a municipality should have an obligation to send out a certified letter return receipt to every homeowner every time you do a master plan update. Think of the cost that would be. But what do we do to better convey that we need affordable housing, we need workforce housing, and the reality is NIMBYism, it's still going to happen in your area. Thank you.
I'm going to take a shot at it, Uri. One of the issues is the relationship between planning commission or the planning and zoning officer or planning director, whatever the term is in your jurisdiction, and the ability to just come out and say what the facts are. I had the support, I'm very fortunate to have the support in both Anne Arundel and in Howard County to be the bad guy. The county executive said, when things go wrong, it is Rutter's fault. When things go right, make sure I get the invite to the groundbreaking and the ribbon cutting. And they just let it go that way. It was then my job to work individually with every council member in both jurisdictions to make sure I had majority votes for what was the program that we wanted to put forward. Anne Arundel was strange because in the executive's first term, she was Democrat. She had 4 Democrats and 3 Republicans on the council. Got nothing done in 4 years. I came in when she was in a second term, but had 4 Republicans and 3 Democrats. I had 5 votes for everything I wanted to do. I had one person who would never vote for anything that, as soon as my name was on it, it was kind of dead. But often 6, always 4, or I didn't come forward. But I knew in talking to the council members one-on-one, I could go out and educate them. I don't see that. Now maybe it's occurring where directors that are in office now would sit down with individual council members and explain to them why things need to be done and get them on board before they hear the 25 people that show up at every hearing and have an objection to what needs to be done. So yes, educating. It's funny, you now under the state have a requirement in some counties, Howard County just passed it, where if you're going to be on the planning board, before you can vote, you have to come to one of these sessions and get some education. There's no requirement for the county council to do that, or for the county commissioners to do that. Think about it.
Shoot, I don't know where to go with this one. You were all going to talk about education, but I said data, it's the first question. Provide them the information, get the information out. And one of the things, the way you do that is different forums. I agree with Joe. One of the things we did in Harford County, and I did in the city of Annapolis, and we do in the Baltimore County as well, and all the jurisdictions, we sit down with affordable housing. Where that project was being, I would sit down, bring the developer into the meeting with the council person, have him show, density is not a dirty word. Affordable housing is a mixture of income across the board. It's not just all subsidized housing. It's not the end of the world. And again, Baltimore County is under a voluntary compliance agreement, right? So we're trying to achieve a goal here, or a mandate, actually. So we're trying to, sit down with each and every one of the council people and say, this isn't a bad thing. I know it's not politically, popular to have these in your neighborhoods, and sometimes they get concentrated. In Baltimore County, that was part of the problem. It was getting concentrated in specific geographic areas in the county, and council people were getting mighty upset, as was their constituents. So we were forced to start moving into different areas of the county and say, this isn't a bad thing. Look at the project. Look how successful it can be, and here's a success story. And that's what you kind of do with the citizens as well. Baltimore County is also starting a sort of a citizen academy, right? They're going to roll out this program where they'll educate the citizens as to what our rules and regulations are, and who has rights and who doesn't. What are their avenues? It's not just I'm against it. What do you don't like about it, and what can we make it better? That's one of the things we did in Harford County. We said, just to criticize and be a NIMBY isn't good enough. You got to come up and say, what are the things that you don't like about this, and there are things that we can, that give and take. So most of the jurisdictions I've worked for all require a community input meeting, right, before the development proceeds any further through the process. The first thing they got to do is go talk to the community. That has at least informed the community of what's going on and gives the opportunity for the developer to interact with those individuals about what exactly is it, because most of them hear rumors and they think it's going to be, a jailhouse or, a detention center. And that's not what it's, necessarily, that's just the rumor mill. So you got to kind of weed out the rumor mills and things like that. But also I get back to providing all the information, educating them on the data, and educating them on the rules and regulations of what us as planning directors or, regulators, this is all the capacity I have in terms of working with things. So, you need to understand my authority versus their rights as a property owner to move forward with a project that may be viable and provide economic development in the jurisdiction. So that's.
If I can jump in here and talk directly to Dan's question, I think, and more power to you, Dan, for the work you've been doing. Beyond just presenting data, I think on the issue you raised about the getting people to take seriously the need for workforce housing, I think perhaps one of the more fruitful avenues to explore is the fiscal impact argument, working with the chambers of commerce, working to educate people about the fiscal impacts and benefits of workforce housing for job growth in Washington County, for the tax base in Washington County. Howard County did a very impressive in-house fiscal impacts study to look at the effects of reducing class size even further on school construction costs, which was huge. But as part of that, they demonstrated that housing in Howard County pays its way, more than pays its way. So that's a very, very affluent county. It may not be true in Washington County, but housing, despite what Joe said up front, generalizing, doesn't typically pay its way. That's not true in all of Maryland. In some parts of Maryland, it does pay its way. And I think the fiscal angle, Dan, and its implications for taxes and revenues may be the most fruitful case, working with chambers of commerce and those kinds of folks, major employers, to, in the end, win your arguments.
Okay, I think we are approaching the magic time of 11 when folks are ready to go get some coffee. I would like to thank Uri for putting this panel together, certainly MDP for organizing this thing, and the city of Frederick for hosting. Of course, want to thank the panelists. I don't think there's a group of planners in the state with more experience and the breadth of experience that we saw today. One other way to describe this panel, to modify Joe's description a little bit, is but cranky old white men. So when we do this again in the future, let's all of us commit to making sure that when we do this panel and we assemble a similar set of folks with this kind of experience that also includes women and people of color. So thank you very much, everybody, for your forbearance. I will look forward to seeing you, and those of you who are from out of town, please go downtown, have lunch, spend your money, and enjoy the wonderful city that Joe has so aptly described. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I want to thank the panel. Great way to start off day 2 of the conference. So we are going to be on break now. Both of these, the next 2 sessions are some programs and ways that state agencies are addressing climate change. The one related to water resources element guidance is going to be this room over here, and down the hall will be Maryland Department of Transportation's panel. So decide which one you'd like to go to, and we'll see you there.